So today I'm going to talk to you about thresholds and songbirds in relation to early seral forest at two scales, stand and landscape. Acknowledge my master's student who actually did a lot of the work on this, Tana Ellis, and other collaborators, Joan Hagar, Brenda McComb, Kevin McGargle, and my postdoc, Jim Rivers. So this is where I came from 3 years ago. This is the Acadian forest in New Brunswick in Canada. And it might look like it's pretty extensive mature forest. This is a mixture of maple and beech, yellow birch, and red spruce. But actually the major forest conservation issue in New Brunswick was the decline of this mature forest. It's declining at about a rate of 1% per year, and that incorporates models of growth. So you can imagine how surprised I was when I arrived in Oregon and started reading some papers about some of the conservation issues in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. One of the first ones I read was this one by Rebecca Kennedy and Tom Spies on declines in hardwood distribution. And they looked at historic distributions of hardwood and found that basically there's been about a 40% decrease in hardwoods across a portion of the Coast Range, and that actually the decrease has also been matched by a shrinkage in the size of patches by about 35%. So this hardwood forest that's often associated with early seral is one of the big issues here, as probably gathered from this conference. So also, this led me to a bunch of other studies that have been done using paleo and dendroecological information and simulation modeling apparently here. One estimate shows that very open and patchy open occupied about 6% of the historical landscape in the Coast Range of Oregon. Differs slightly from an earlier study that showed 30% early seral across the landscape. The difference in these two estimates had to do with the fact the first one was really looking at completely high-severity fires and no residual trees at all. The second one also incorporated early seral that could come up in gaps as a function of lower severity disturbances. And then in some projections, Tom and others put forward the idea that diverse early seral is projected to decline as much as 100% from the historic range of variation. So it gives you some idea that this early seral condition is something that we perhaps should be concerned about. And why is this? Well, there are two hypotheses, really. Probably both of them are reasonable. One is that, as most of you know, our forestry is getting more intensive across the landscape over the last 50 years. We tend to think less about maintaining broadleaf shrubs that Joan talked about, and more about trying to maximize volume on a particular site. And also, of course, we're seeing succession happening on a lot of our federal lands. So I don't think I'm telling you any secrets that you didn't know about. But many have argued quite recently that structurally and compositionally diverse early seral forests are now some of the scarcest habitat in the region, quite different to what I was used to. So if you look at some of the population trends for some of the species that Joan Hagar and I study, the result is actually quite dramatic. These are two species of birds that we found to be associated with early seral forest. On the left is orange-crowned warbler, and on the right is rufous hummingbird. And both are declining at about 4% per year. So just to give you some reference, the spotted owl is declining at an expected rate of about 2.8% per year. So is this something we should be concerned about? So in an effort to try and understand some of the mechanisms behind these population declines, we considered looking at bird distributions as a function of vegetation structure at two spatial scales. It's pretty well known now that different species of birds are associated with different types of habitat. So at one scale, we're interested in stand structure and composition as predictors of bird occurrence. At another scale, though, we know that even these tiny little 10 to 15 gram birds are also correlated with processes that are happening at much larger landscape scales. It sounds a bit strange that you'd have a 10-gram bird carrying what happens at 1 kilometer or 2 kilometer radius around its territories, but it turns out this has to do with dispersal mechanisms and actually accessing mates that aren't formally part of the pair bond. So the study questions here, which songbird species are associated with early seral broadleaf forest? We wanted to quantify some of the hypotheses we'd had in the past. Is the occurrence of these bird species influenced by landscape composition? We strongly expected that it would be. But then most importantly, are there threshold levels in broadleaf in stands and landscapes that might help managers in setting management targets. And I'm going to talk about that in a sec. And then finally, is it true that habitat change is driving these population declines of some of these species that we're seeing? Of course, a lot of the species that I study are migrant birds. And one strong hypothesis is that the declines we see are actually due to changes that are happening on a wintering grounds, or maybe even during migration. So I just want to talk briefly about thresholds as quantitative targets. And this is becoming something you're seeing more and more in the literature and also in some management recommendations. So the idea here is that across some habitat variable on the x-axis, you might have nonlinear patterns in the response of some species. So population size, occurrence, or density might rise steeply across some section of that gradient. So this causes statistical problems if we assume linearity and a linear regression. But actually, we can capitalize on this as managers by trying to find these thresholds and picking conservation targets that fall just above them. So in this example, it would be a bit silly to set the conservation target where the orange line is. But by moving up the x-axis just a small proportion, we can dramatically increase the population size of this theoretical species. So we wanted to test for these thresholds across Oregon as much as possible. Of course, being a new arrival, I didn't have any data at my disposal, so I did what any good scientist does, and they take other people's data. So avian point counts are wonderful in that they're collected in an amazingly similar way around the world. It's a technique that was developed about 20 years ago. And what we do is we stand in one place and we count all of the birds that we hear, the singing males. And we write them down in our data sheet. And often the length of time is about 10 minutes. It's often exactly 10 minutes. And so these avian point count data are quite comparable across studies. So we started collecting point count data from previous studies that had been done around Oregon. One was done at Klamath Bird Observatory. They had literally thousands of points. Kevin McGargle and Brenda McComb have data from the Coast Range. Joan Hagar had some, and Joe Fontaine had some from the Biscuit Fire. So after collecting all of these data together, we actually contacted the authors of 14 studies. We ended up with 4,375 point counts, which would take a small army of people to collect, but we had all of these data across different years. So this is the spatial distribution of those points across western Oregon. You can see really a lot of them are clustered in the south and in the north, and those reflect the Klamath bird data and the Coast Range bird data from Kevin McGargle's paper. But in total, 127,000 bird detections of 110 species. So quite a powerful data set to address some of these questions about thresholds. One of the big disappointments to me coming west was that we seem to lack some really reliable landscape scale data. In New Brunswick, we have such a small area, and every tree is so incredibly valuable. Our trees only grow at about 1 centimeter a year, I think. We've got an incredible forest inventory that's spatial. In the West, this doesn't really occur to any great extent, except that recently, Janet Oman and Matthew Gregory developed a model based on regional forest survey data, remote sensing data, and a technique they call imputation to try and get spatial distributions of a forest across large areas. And this is what those data look like. Probably some of you are familiar with these. So it gives you some idea of the spatial distribution of some of these things that we might be interested in. The red that you see on this map is actually the distribution of broadleaf forest across space. You can also get more detailed information about the age class. So we use these data in combination with the point count data to look at thresholds in birds as a function of this broadleaf class. So this is a percent hardwood canopy cover across western Oregon from the GNN. And actually these models perform not so well at the level of the individual pixel, 30 meters by 30 meters, but they perform very well at a lot broader landscape scales. So in our efforts to try and determine threshold at landscape scales, it was quite appropriate. So independent variables we had, the percent broadleaf that I showed you, the percent early seral broadleaf that we defined as less than 10 centimeters, actually quadratic mean diameter, at different spatial extents, 150, 500 meters, and 2,000 meters around a point. So this is the sort of data we were collecting. Imagine us point counting at this yellow dot, and we had more than 4,000 of these across Oregon. And then we simply summarized the landscape data from the GNN at these moderate and large spatial scales. and then tried to predict bird distributions. So how did we detect thresholds? Well, there actually wasn't a lot of information out there on how to detect thresholds in ecological data when I first started with this study. So we ended up having to go to the medical literature to look for some threshold techniques. So this guy, Vito Maggio, an Italian, developed what he called segmented logistic regression that allows you to test for thresholds in the probability of something, that's black-capped chickadee on the y-axis, as a function of something, in this case deciduous forest. So in their case, they were looking at, for example, how many episodes of The Wiggles my kid could watch before he gets attention deficit disorder. But in this case, we could also apply it pretty well to species distributions as a function of something that's of management interest. So pretty simple. You fit a linear regression and a second regression after that and a breakpoint. So you're adding a couple of parameters to a model. And I'll show you some of these results. So first of all, 11 of the 27 models actually showed some kind of threshold response. So if you'd fit something linear to these data, you would have either found non-significance or something that really wasn't correct. So thresholds for these songbird species range broadly from about 1.5% in a landscape up to 24%. And that's the sum of canopy cover at these large spatial extents. It was the 2,000 meter spatial extent actually that was the best at predicting these bird distributions. So we had some examples here. On the bottom left is Pacific slope flycatcher, with a threshold around 8% deciduous or broadleaf forest in a landscape. And a strange shape, it actually drops off past 10%. It might have something to do with the fact that species is actually using a coniferous and a deciduous component within a landscape. And then some species like the far right, the Nashville warbler, exhibited more of a classic threshold response. And again, at around 8%. Really, it didn't matter for this species how much more broadleaf you had in a landscape. Its probability of occurrence at a point wasn't any higher. So this is the response to early seral broadleaf, and we found a positive response by 8 of the 12 species we examined. Some of them were thresholded. You can see the third one over from the right is orange-crowned warbler. Again, another classic threshold response. Some approaching a threshold response. One big take-home from this was that between the two study areas, the Coast Range and the Klamath, we had big differences in big regional variation in the thresholds. So I think this is an important take-home message that you can't take a study, some results from a study, even in southern Oregon, and apply them to northern Oregon. Of course, the species are somewhat different, but the ways in which they were responding to the landscape also differed, even within the same species. So this was an interesting bit for me, that these data that Janet put together to measure landscape distributions of vegetation were actually quite good at predicting bird distributions. This, in AUC, might not mean much to you, but this is a measure of prediction accuracy that ranges from 0 to 1. And so prediction accuracy was about 83%, roughly speaking, when we took into account something like spatial autocorrelation. So the next question then is, well, okay, we have found these positive associations with this early seral broadleaf on birds, fine. But can we really say anything about that influencing the demography of these species? Is it possible that something driving the decline? So to test that, we basically looked at the correlation between how strongly related a bird was to early seral broadleaf and its population trend over the long term. And this is what we found. So on the x-axis here is the coefficient, so the slope of the relationship between broadleaf forest and early seral and associated early seral birds. So the farther it is to the right, the more early seral broadleaf the species dependent it is. And on the y-axis is the population trend measured from the Breeding Bird Survey over 40 years. So here you can see a pretty strong relationship between how associated with early seral forest the species is and its population trend. So some of these species like orange-crowned warbler and rufous hummingbird that are declining at around 4% per year are the ones most strongly associated with early seral broadleaf. So some preliminary conclusions then from this work. Broadleaf, there's a positive influence of early seral and late seral broadleaf forest on many species of birds. The population consequence of these may have already started, and there seems to be very high variation in thresholds among species and among regions. So there seems to be no simple rule of thumb about how much we need. And really, we need more research at stand and landscape scales. And obviously, all these models are correlative that I'm presenting to you, so some kinds of manipulations would be extremely helpful. Okay, so I already mentioned to you that we can expect birds to respond to vegetation at 2 scales, landscape and stand. So now I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the stand level work. And this work has been these data have been collected by Tana Ellis over the last couple of years, just outside of Corvallis here in the Oregon Coast Range. So, 2 research questions. Does the amount of hardwood cover within a stand influence occurrence of songbirds and their productivity, how many young they produce? And are there threshold levels of hardwood within a stand, in addition to at the landscape scale? So to do this, it was a retrospective study across stands aged from 5 to 9 years old, and a stratified sample across hardwood cover ranging from 0 to 35%. So at one end, we had stands that really didn't have any early seral deciduous in them at all, and at the other end, bottom right, we had stands that were actually quite full with early seral vegetation. So the approach here, rather than just doing point counts, the problem with point counts, of course, is that, you might have caught this, only the males tend to sing, which isn't tremendously useful data when you're thinking about population trends and productivity. Males don't necessarily always know what they're doing when it comes to habitat selection. So the benefit of Tana's study was that she was actually capturing males, but also females, and then young, and we could get some idea of site-level productivity, or at least habitat use by birds that were hatched and fledged on those sites. So she relied on these gigantic hairnets, mist nets set up across at 8 of them within a site, and she captured birds, many different species, color banded them, so we could get some idea of recaptures. And this was actually a surprising result to me in itself. Over a period of 2 years, over 6,000 total net captures, and that amounted to 4,600 individual captures of birds. So there's huge bird biomass in some of these early seral stands, including the ones actually that don't have a lot of deciduous forest, but I'll talk about that in a second. So a total of 53 species. And these are some of the more common suspects found in the stands. White-crowned sparrow at the top left, Swainson's thrush, orange-crowned warbler, this one that's declining that I told you about, McGilvery's warbler, willow flycatcher, and then some oddities like a pygmy owl on the top right, lazuli bunting, and at the bottom this a bird from the East Coast, actually. It was caught, probably a vagrant that had its GPS messed up and ended up in one of our nets. So one of the first results, counter to what we expected, not a very strong influence of hardwood cover on the species richness of birds. We really expected to see that as you added more species of tree to a site, at least to some threshold, you'd see more species of birds. But this wasn't the case. And these are, I have to emphasize, these are really early results, and we need to do some new statistical results using rarefaction to control for different number of individuals within sites. But it's looking as if we're not seeing a strong effect of hardwood cover on species richness. Now, part of the reason for that, this is a frequency distribution of all of the species we captured at these sites on the X, and on the Y is just the number of birds that we caught. And it seems that some species really are strongly associated with the coniferous part of the stand, and some the deciduous, and some mixed. So of course, as you move towards a more deciduous composition, you're actually seeing some coniferous forest birds falling out. But this is one of the interesting results. If you look at just the total number of captures of birds across these sites, you find quite a strong threshold relationship. So just picture this as if you weighed all the birds within a stand, the total biomass of birds across a hardwood canopy cover gradient, you end up with quite a strong threshold at around 6%. So this is a really strongly supported threshold relationship, 6.7%. I was interested to see that Klaus's study is looking at around a 6% deciduous, or at least 6% gaps. And in the end, actually, when we added just one landscape variable, this model explained about 45% of the variance. The threshold was a little higher when we considered only birds that gleaned insects from foliage, like the ones Joan was talking to you about. So another question that we asked had to do with whether we actually do see a difference between the males in a stand and the productivity. So in other words, are the males good at finding the good places to live? Are they good at selecting habitat? So for this, we could compare the fit of models for the males. This is a mature orange-crowned warbler on the left versus a young of the year on the right. And the answer in the end was no. There's a very strong relationship of hardwood on this particular species, for example. But when we looked at a difference in that relationship as a function of age, there really wasn't much of an effect at all. So it turns out that orange-crowned warblers, at least, and some of the associated species are quite good at determining where they should be selecting habitat. And the final thing I'm going to talk to you about a bit is other components of demography. So obviously, we're seeing some of these population declines, possibly as a result of early seral forest decline. We wanted to get at some of the mechanisms for this. So is this due to differences in adult survival, nest success, juvenile survival? These are all things we could test for. And a fair bit is known, actually, about adult survival and nest success. But almost nothing is known about juvenile survival. So it's being called the black box of avian demography, migrant avian demography. So we were really focused on trying to understand that, which very little was known about. So the idea here was, is there some carryover effect of a bird nesting in a site that's low-quality habitat to a subsequent part of its breeding cycle, the juvenile dispersing phase? So first of all, we can determine whether nest success equals habitat quality. Do we really only need to measure nest success, or is there something independent about the vegetation these birds are using post-fledging that could determine their survival? And then secondly, do conditions in the nest influence subsequent juvenile survival? So we're interested in what this Swainson's thrush on the left, where it nests, does it have an influence on how well its fledglings actually survive in nature? Now the problem here was that a lot of our stands look like this. So I don't know how many of you have actually tried to find a nest in this, but not surprisingly, it turns out to be a little bit difficult. So to try and find nests, we engaged in a rather complicated process that involved attaching radio transmitters to adult female Swainson's thrushes, following them with telemetry, and then hopefully finding the nest. Unfortunately, about 50 or 60% of our nests failed due to predation. So we went back out and followed the female around until she tried to nest again. And then we found the nest and added a transmitter to the juveniles within that nest. So when they fledged, we could get an idea of how long they survived until they migrated. So again, this is only about the third or fourth time this has been done with a migrant songbird. So then we follow them around to see how long it is before they get eaten by a snake or before they migrate. So quite a few of our birds were actually taken by garter snakes, even once they were quite mobile. So juvenile survival, some preliminary results. In the end, we tagged 22 juveniles, 36% of which survived. So it gives you some idea of how important this stage is in terms of the demography of these populations. 68% of the mortality occurred within the first 8 days of leaving the nest. And the best predictors of this, one, hardwood during the post-fledging period. So this was how much hardwood forest these juvenile birds were using as they moved around a landscape, influenced how well they survived. So a demographic effect of hardwood. And then secondly, and this was a bit of a strange thing, cort in the nest. Cort is a stress hormone, and we pulled blood from these birds. And cort is an indicator of how stressed you are. We expected the more stressed the bird, the less likely it should be to survive, and it turned out the opposite. So the birds that were actually stressed in the nest were more likely to survive in nature following. Now these are preliminary results, and we're doing it again, but these two variables alone were the best predictors of whether or not these juveniles survived, one of which is of strong conservation interest, the other of which I don't really want to get out because I have no interest in being more stressed in order to survive. So a summary. Bird distributions at the stand and landscape scales are influenced by the abundance of early seral forest. Demographic effects are apparent in the breeding bird survey data. And these demographic effects could be partly due to post-fledging survival on the breeding grounds. So the next steps with this study, we're interested in trying to turn this from a retrospective correlative study into something that's more manipulative. So we now have funding from the USDA to do a study on how birds are affected, the demography in particular, are affected by management intensity at the stand scale. And Oregon Department of Forestry and several industrial collaborators are involved with this. Secondly, I'm trying to address the question of whether birds, or how much birds matter in terms of their trophic influence on a stand. Are these birds actually eating many insects in a way that would affect tree productivity and tree growth? And then finally, we're going to be doing more extensive tests of thresholds. We have data from now across all of the US and Canada to see if there are some thresholds in forest birds as a function of management intensity at the landscape scale. So I'd just like to thank all of these folks who have been involved with either letting us on their land or providing us with funding over the last 2 years. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Time for a couple questions from us.
At the back. No, these data are all from large cuts. We don't have data from gaps or large disturbances. So some of the Hagar data are from thin stands, but not to any large gaps.
Is there already any research looking at the effects of the transmitters on bird productivity or survivorship?
Well, survivorship's a bit of a trick because we don't really know how we'd measure. It's a very good question. We don't really know how we'd measure survival in any alternative way. But these transmitters, I should mention, weigh less than about 3% of the bird's body mass, and they're quite unlikely to be affecting their survival. Yes?
Did you look at effects of half size or other aspects of landscape composition as opposed to structure as opposed to composition?
No, for this preliminary take, we really just looked at the influence of landscape composition. No fragmentation variables.